Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
The following podcast was recorded on the 21st of January 2013. This week we hear from John Given, who talked on Max Weber and the spiders from inner space.
Congratulations everybody for making it out on a horrible night like this. Just going to say a couple of things by way of introduction. First thing is apologies to Max Weber, because I had a quick look at what I'd said I was going to talk about and realised it wasn't really very much to do with Max Weber. But it does take off from his quote about humans being animals suspended in webs of their own, webs of significance which they themselves have spun. So my kind of interest is really in about, my area of interest is to do with the narrative performance of identity. So I'm going to just, in 20 minutes, which is pretty brief to jump through this kind of material, I'm going to talk about three themes. So I'm going to try and give about 5 minutes to each theme, and I'll probably overshoot on each of them. First thing I want to talk about, and Jennifer can help me with this by grabbing hold of that and disappearing towards the back of the room, is the importance of language in the evolution of our species, Homo sapiens. Can you just lift that up over you there? And keep pulling that. And the second thing I want to talk about is identity considered from a narrative perspective. I want to talk about the narrative performance of identity. And finally, I want to talk about the impact of globalization on the narrative performance of our identities. Now this visual aid here, which I was not allowed to use PowerPoint, so I've come up with this kind of idea here. This represents 6 million years. So where Jennifer is, we've gone around the corner, I see, so you have to go to the back of the room and come back, and this represents 6 million years, which apparently, according to authoritative sources, and this will be a characteristic of my little presentation. I'm not going to deal with anything boring like evidence. I'm just going to throw out a few ideas here, and we'll perhaps deal with evidence in the discussion. So here we've got 6 million years. Where Jennifer's standing is apparently the first of the hominids, the first of the apes. So here we are, proudly, at the end of 6 million years of evolution. And along the way, a few points to note. Each one of these gold jobs here represents a million years. So 2.5 million years down there towards the back of the room represents the emergence of Homo sapiens, dated at about 250,000 years. Of course, all these dates are kind of highly contested by everybody who's got any interest in this kind of subject, but 250,000 years. So, coming down the line a bit, round about where this gentleman is, which puts us at about, don't get confused with these things, it's supposed to be a big long line. 1 million years, 2 million years, 3 million years, okay. There we are, you're on about a million years, okay? And so, million years, half a million years. So here we are on 250,000 years, which is approximately when Homo sapiens was supposed to have diverged as a distinct species from the rest of the ape species. So we have this 6 million year evolution of ape species, and apparently here at 250,000 years we have Homo sapiens. So this is just, I want you to bear in mind this kind of timescale. Of course, if we were really going to go for it, we could go a lot further back, but then Jennifer would have to go somewhere well north of Anik, really, since life is supposed to have developed at about 4 billion years, I think, ish. So if we were to kind of really discuss what we are as a species, we would be interested in a kind of archaeology of the senses. That is, at what point did we evolve the various senses through which we experience the world? So the 5 senses I'm talking about here. And whatever their order of priority is in our perceiving of the world. And that would entail a kind of archaeology of the senses, which is well beyond my expertise, and I suspect quite a lot of other disciplines as well. But we have this idea of an evolution of the species up to here's Homo sapiens. Obviously, in the kind of period before this, they had our kind of predecessors had evolved the senses. They apprehended the world, the chimpanzees, the apes. They were tool makers at about a million years, I think, about 1.5 million years. Tool makers, 2 million years actually, I think, the first tool makers, Homo habilis. And there's an interesting thing about the evolution of the tools just being stone flakes. Up until about, I think it was about 300,000 years, tools started to become shaped, but shaped in an aesthetic kind of way, for purposes other than, just a flake of flint that had been knocked off a core. So 250,000 years, about 100,000 years, and this is the point really at which my story sort of picks up, at about 100,000 years, and this is highly debatable, between 100,000 years and 50,000 years, something happened which was to define the species, and that something was the evolution of language, the evolution of symbolic language. So when I talk about a narrative performance of identity, the reason I'm showing you this is that although I think language, I'm going to argue that language is the defining characteristic of our species, and by language here I mean symbolic language, not alarm calls, not mating calls, although these certainly figure, but symbolic language, by which I mean a language which conveys multiple meanings, through which we can convey meaning on the world. So I'm talking here about a language which has tense, so we can think of the future, we can imagine the future, we can imagine the past, we can recreate the past. So symbolic language as being the defining characteristic of the species at about 250,000 years. But here we get into kind of a lot of argumentation. At what point did the species really acquire language? Now, I think it was 1866, the French Academy of Sciences, the French Academy of Linguistics barred any further discussion of this topic. When did language evolve? Because it's such a kind of complicated and controversial topic. And there were a couple of schools of thought, one being that language evolved in an evolutionary way gradually from about 250,000 years through tool-making processes, the hand. And it's interesting that when we look at the way that people speak, there's a lot of hand gestures going on, and that when you look at brain scanning, and there's quite an interesting overlap with this area with contemporary developments in neuroscience, looking at what's happening in the brain when people speak. It's the same areas of the brain are being activated that are activated when we're gesturing. So this is a kind of link with development of tool usage and language. So there's one argument there which says this was just to be understood as a very gradual evolutionary development. There's another one which says that something significant happened at about 50,000 years. About 50,000 years ago, and these people talk about the Big Bang, the cultural Big Bang, when symbolic language became the defining feature of the species. And this corresponds, of course, with migrations out of Africa and so on. So you'll probably drop this for a bit. Although I would just point, you can drop that, Jenny. Sorry about the person with the string in their hair back there. But 250,000 years. So 10,000 years. First agriculture, 6,000 years, first writing systems, mass literacy, well that's debatable, Emily's been marking essays recently in universities, mass literacy probably 100 years, 150 years, and so on. So you can see the kind of timescales we're dealing in here. Basically what I'd like to summarize here is that for the whole of human evolution, all knowledge and all culture has been passed on in an oral and performative way. By performative I mean dance, song, music, and so on. So all human culture for over probably 99.9% of human evolution. All human culture is passed on in an oral and performative way. And if we think about hunter-gatherer groups, which constitute the bulk of human existence, you think about Australian Aborigines and their existence for, say, 50,000 years, the earliest occupation of Australia, until the first fleet arrived, 1766. I thought you were Australian. Sorry.
I lost my thread.
17. Well, you had your thread for long enough. Till the first fleet, a rather uninterrupted kind of cultural momentum there, and all of the landscape forms, their relationship with landscape, we could talk about a narrative landscape. Every object in the landscape was mythologized or impacted in their belief system, so that every landform, was connected to a story about the creation of this landform in the dream time, ancestor creatures and so on, an entirely narrative landscape. And that, I'm arguing, is the kind of substrata for what it means to be human, that we all live in narrative landscapes. So that's the first sort of theme I wanted to bring out. The second theme really is a bit more theoretical, really. I want to talk about this American philosopher who's interested in neuroscience, Daniel Dennett, and he deploys two metaphors which I find really suggestive and very interesting. He talks, for instance, about the self, and this is a sort of theory of identity I'm going to elaborate here a little bit, and he talks about the self as being thought of as a centre of narrative gravity. The self as a centre of narrative gravity. In other words, we are constituted by the stories which are attracted to us or which we're attracted to. So it's the first idea of the self as a centre of narrative gravity. And of course that does connect to the previous theme about hunter-gatherers living entirely in a narrative landscape. These are pre-literate societies where all knowledge was communicated in an oral and performative way. And I would argue, and this is a bit of a leap, that the brain has been wired to understand the world in a storied form. And I'll elaborate on that shortly. So the two metaphors that Daniel Dennett deploys in relation to identity are the idea of the self as a centre of narrative gravity, and the second really, and this is where it gets a bit sort of neuroscientific and way beyond my kind of actual area of expertise. He talks about the brain, and this is kind of where the connection with contemporary neuroscience becomes very interesting when you're looking at contemporary brain scanning images and so on. He talks about what he describes as a Joycean machine. A Joycean machine. And what he means by this is that the brain is functioning with all these sensory inputs, the 6 million years we're talking about here, this archaeology of the senses, all this sensory data with which we're being flooded all the time through all the senses is impacting in the brain. And at any one time, there is a kind of what Daniel Dennett describes as a coalition of neuro-computational alliances which function at any one time to focus on a particular topic in hand. And the focus is then translated into consciousness via language. He talks then, this is the Joycean machine, the idea of an internalized conversation through which we make sense of the world. This is the spiders from inner space that I kind of referred to, the way I think about it. These internalized conversations we have in order to make sense of the world, which is a decoding in a way of the sensory flood focused on any particular moment. Now, most of the conversations, most of our kind of language behaviors are actually conversations we have with ourselves. These are the conversations which are going on all the time, whether you like it or not. That is, you might be doing something very important, but you're thinking about what you're going to have for dinner in the evening or whatever. These conversations are running all the time. So this is the Joycean machine. But we focus at any particular, for any particular environmental cue. So that's the idea of the Joycean machine. And I think that's really ties in with the idea of narrative performance of identity, which is suggesting really that we are constantly rehearsing versions of ourselves. We're constantly rehearsing versions of ourselves. And that there is no fixed focus to our identity. So this sort of perspective is really at war with traditional theories of identity, which suggest, that through socialization and so on, there's a kind of fixed core of identity. This kind of approach suggests something quite different, which is that anybody's identity is highly malleable, which leads me on really to the third theme, with a bit of an eye on the clock here, which is really to do with the contemporary situation. So this is to do with contemporary social theory and the impact really of globalization on the shaping of contemporary narrative landscapes. So, one thing worth thinking about at this point is what is your first memory? I meant to ask that a little while ago, but something for you to think about, and we'll come back to it in the discussion. Just to think about what is your first memory of yourself. And I'll refer to that in the discussion, hopefully. When I talk about globalization, I'm talking about the way in which contemporary cultural landscapes are being shaped by simultaneous flows of power, technology, money, and what have I got? 4. I've lost one. Power, technology, money, and I've lost one. Where are we? Any guesses? No, I don't like that. It'll come to me. Let me see. Power, technology, money, culture. Okay. All these things, in any particular locality, these things are flowing, either fast or slow, depending on whether you're in a kind of rather traditional situation or in a highly volatile one. So a highly volatile one is somewhere like the Pearl River Delta in Shanghai, and the kind of creation of mega cities. So this is the kind of environment of evolutionary adaptation, if you like, within which people are trying to make sense of the world and decode make sense of a cultural narrative. What does that mean? 10 minutes left?
10 minutes left.
Oh, okay, that's good. That's more than I thought, really. I was looking at the clock and thinking, well, I've only got, I thought you'd give me marks out of 10 there. I thought, I'm doing very well here. Okay. So this idea of globalization as being this kind of simultaneous flows of all these processes. And you can kind of break this down, and this is where it will get pretty complicated. But people like Zygmunt Bauman, for instance, a kind of prolific writer on contemporary identity, talks about liquid identities, the way in which our identities have to be contemporary identities in highly globalized parts of the world can be thought of as liquid rather than fixed. They're constantly shifting and changing to adapt to the rapidly changing environments in which we find ourselves. So in relation to Dennett's idea about the self as a center of narrative gravity, I tend to think about 3 more kind of focused areas to think about that. One in relation to the body as a center of narrative identity, place as a center of narrative identity, and time. We're all children of our time. We all come from some place, or we find ourselves in some place. And of particular importance and relevance, we are embodied creatures. We have a body. You wake up in the morning, you look in the mirror, you have to deal with it. You are an embodied creature. And quite a lot of social science has only rather latterly come around to confronting this idea that we actually are creatures with bodies. And this is why I went to such lengths to kind of talk about the archaeology of the senses. Because again, quite a lot of the data from the brain scans is showing things like, for instance, that we make decisions before we've come up with an explanation as to why we're making the decision. And this suggests that the senses are working in a kind of pre-narrative way. So, I'm not suggesting that narrative, the way in which we decode the sensory material, is the whole business, but the way in which we decode the sensory material into narrative is highly relative to the situations we find ourselves in. And one of the things that, for instance, if we think about one of those flows, like, say, technology, we think about the impact of digital technologies on socialization. I mean, how much time do you spend in your daily lives in front of a screen? for instance? Well, some interesting research, a range of interesting research. One which talks about children in the States between the age of 3 and 7 years old, who are awake on average for about 11.5 hours, and 30% of that time they're spending in front of a screen of some sort. So the interface between the natural world, or the world, and their kind of internalized conversations is a digital interface. And by the time those children are 3 years old, they can recognize over 200 brand images. Over 200 brand images, which means that the kind of internal narrative landscape of these children is being commodified, commercialized, such that their kind of most intimate subconscious desires are already part of a kind of system of consumerism. And I think this is quite an alarming kind of insight and interesting application of these ideas about how is the narrative landscape being molded by these processes of globalization. And I mean, that's just one instance. If you were to kind of think about the body, for instance, just take the focus on the body, there's a whole range of kind of writing now. There's an interesting book by Juvin called The Coming of the Body, where he talks about the way in which identity, contemporary identity, is being forced more and more back into highly individualized embodiment, i.e. a preoccupation with the body. So you just think here about cosmetic surgery, the consumption, and just think about the amount of money you spend personally on issues, products which are to do with the body, you know, the lotions and potions, clothes obviously, and all the rest of it, but consumption as being focused on the body and the image of the body as projected. There's also this interesting idea about the impact of technology on the way we think about the body. I don't know if you've come across this interesting idea of escape velocity as applied to medical science. The idea that the advances in medical science are now so rapid that the child has been born who will live to be over 300 years old. Because, you know, with stem cell technology and all the rest of it, you know, everything can be put in a fridge and grown and kind of plugged back in. Hip replacements, knee replacements, to mention the most mundane things, but, you know, the advent of stem cell technology and all that kind of stuff opens up a kind of arena where narratives of the body are being fundamentally transformed. I mean, there was a time when you got sick and you died, and that was what was to be expected. Now, we get sick and we expect there will be a cure, because technology will provide this for us. So, you know, in that sense, narratives of the body are being changed in a really fundamental way. I mean, that's just one example. You could generalize this way of thinking to thinking about how our sense of place is being changed, how places are being radically changed, our sense of place, and also sense of time, what constitutes a sense of time. So when I asked you to think about your earliest memories, did anybody manage to get around to that while I was rabbiting on?
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dun City, who host the events.